Welcome to the University of Ottawa. My name is Patty Tamara-Leonard. I'm here, I'm a professor here, an associate professor here of applied ethics at the University of Ottawa. First thing to do is to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Alghabra Nation. And I'm super happy to be here today to represent the Centre for International Policy Studies in the University of Ottawa to welcome you here today for an incredibly important event. An incredibly important and well-timed event because the objective today is to have a conversation about the role that Canada can play in supporting and protecting LGBTI rights internationally. And of course, it is the week after Mr. Trudeau made a historic announcement apologizing to this community for certain among the harms that they've faced over the last many years. So it is an incredibly important and timely event, and it is being jointly hosted by SIPS here, as well as by Matt DeCourcey and Omar Alghabra, who I understand is not yet.
He's right here.
Who I was not yet
Snuck in.
Yes, it's a pleasure to meet you. And so they will, in a moment, come up and introduce the event more fully. But just so that everybody's on the same page, according to me, this event will focus on the advances and obstacles faced globally with protecting the human rights of LGBTI persons, and with a particular emphasis and focus on how Canada can help this, in particular how it can work to advance equality worldwide. We will eventually proceed by way of moderated questions shortly. So what this is going to look like is I'm going to sit in the middle there and I'm going to ask incredibly pointed and interesting questions to our moderator, none of which they've seen in advance, and then we will... I'll leave that to you to see whether that was really a joke or not. And then we will invite the audience to talk to our questioners directly as well. So hopefully we will be able to proceed by discussion and to share some thoughts on these important kinds of questions. So I will return to this podium to introduce panelists, but first Matt and Omar are going to come and talk about this event in a little more detail. Or maybe just...
I'll come up first, and then I'll have the pleasure of introducing my colleague. Right? The microphone only comes on for one person at a time. Patty, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to SIPS and the University of Ottawa for the invitation to be here. I'm Matt DeCourcey, Parliamentary Secretary to Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland. Et au nom de mon collègue Chrystia, je suis tellement heureux d'être ici parmi vous, et je vous remercie d'être venu pour cette conversation, et certainement je remercie encore l'Université d'Ottawa qui nous accueille ici aujourd'hui, ainsi que nos panélistes qui ont tellement d'expérience à partager avec vous aujourd'hui. Je veux aussi reconnaître qu'on est ici sur le territoire traditionnel de la nation algonquine, et dans cette année du Canada 150, nous célébrons la nécessité d'avancer dans un esprit de réconciliation avec les peuples autochtones, ainsi que la célébration de diversité et d'inclusion que nous savons est une force de la Canada dont nous parlerons aujourd'hui. Dans quelques brefs jours, le 10 décembre, nous célébrons la journée des droits de l'homme qui commémore l'adoption en 1948 la Déclaration universelle sur les droits de l'homme. Alors le moment est donc particulièrement bien choisi pour discuter de le sujet du forum aujourd'hui, les droits de la personne des membres de la communauté LGBTQ2 ici au Canada et certainement à travers le monde. In the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's a firm assertion of the recognition of the equal human dignity that we all share, of the equal and inalienable rights that we all share that are the foundation for freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Now we know while there are signs that there's progress being made globally on the advancement of human rights for LGBTQ2 persons, we know as well that there are some discouraging signs of retreat in some places around the world. In the past year alone, killings, assaults, mass detentions, discriminatory legislation and policies that target LGBTQ2 persons have been witnessed in multiple countries and regions, including Chechnya, Egypt, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Tanzania. So today's event brings together a cross-section of our Ottawa community, parliamentarians, human rights activists and advocates, academics, and many interested individuals to discuss human current rights situation of LGBTQ2 persons around the world and here. And we think this is an important opportunity for us to discuss the root causes of both the successes we've seen as well as some of the retreats and setbacks we've seen in relation to the human rights of LGBTQ2 persons. And it also gives us an opportunity to discuss ways that Canada can take on a greater leadership role in the world when it comes to the espousal and defense of the human rights of LGBTQ2 persons. And that's why I'm so glad to have this esteemed panel here today. I want to thank you once again on behalf of my minister, Krista Freeland, and ask my colleague Omar, who I have the pleasure to sit with in the House of Commons, to come and bring some brief remarks as well. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Matt. My name is Omar Alghabra. I'm a member of Parliament for Mississauga Centre. I'm also the Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Foreign Affairs, specializing in consular affairs. And it is a great pleasure and an honor for me to be here. I want to echo Matt's gratitude for the hosts and the panelists. As well, we have members here from the Office of Human Rights, Freedom and Inclusion with us here tonight. You know, one of the greatest privileges about being a member of Parliament is it opens up one's eyes. As a member of Parliament, you have access to information and people that you would never have had you not been in that office. And I'm gonna put a twist on Spider-Man's words and say, with great knowledge comes great responsibility. And yes, you meet tremendous people, but you also realize the challenges and the obstacles that are before us. But I want to take stock in the progress that we've made, particularly on the LGBTQ issue. I was elected for the first time in the House of Commons in 2006. 10 years ago, and I really don't mean to be partisan here, but I want to say that some political parties thought it was a political winner to bring up equal marriage issues, to try to reverse equal marriage, because it was seen as a political winner. Today, there's consensus in Canada that it is a basic right for Canadians to have the right to marry whoever they love and whoever they want to be with. And that's something to be proud of. We've come a long way, but we also still have a long way to go. In fact, it only took this year for us to acknowledge the wrongs of the past, of our policies, of our practices, and to have the Prime Minister offer an apology for those past mistakes. But also, as a Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Consular Affairs, I get exposed to all kinds of cases of discrimination against LGBTQ members around the world, whether they are Canadians or non-Canadians. And I'm proud to say that on behalf of the Canadian government, on behalf of the people of Canada, I've always carried those difficulties and those pains and those rights with me everywhere I went and stood up for them on behalf of our government, on behalf of Canadians. So, and one of that example is Canada as co-chairing with Chile, a coalition of 35 countries and civil society, members of civil society, where we are advocating the rights of LGBTQ around the world. So we continue to stand up for rights around the world, human rights, including LGBTQ members, community members, and we will continue to look for opportunities to be constructive on the world stage and here in Canada. So I'm looking forward to this discussion, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you again for giving us the opportunity to be with you here.
I'm back. Hello again. So look, I'm a professor. You do a professor of podium, they always have to say something. And I'm going to say about 3 things, which everybody in this room already agrees with. That I think it's important to set the stage. So I think it is an incredibly important time to think seriously about the role that Canada can and should play on the global stage with respect to LGBTI rights. It almost goes without saying that if you're an LGBTI person, Canada is a great place to be, comparatively speaking. And we have learned a lot in the struggles that we have faced to get where we are. And without saying much more right now, maybe over drinks later, as a result of the change in the American administration, there's a real space here for leadership on this portfolio, which Canada is poised to be able to take, joining in other countries in the Equal Coalition, which maybe we'll talk a little bit more about what can be done there. So I think it's a really exciting space to be in. I think this is a great moment, and it's exciting to have members of government here who are ready to take this global. And those of us who work in Canada on protecting the rights of LGBTI persons in Canada know, of course, even as we go abroad, we have a lot of work to do here in Canada to protect and support the rights of LGBTI persons. We listened, I already talked about Mr. Trudeau, we listened to his apology. I'm probably not the only person in this room who cried. But I think we are collectively but need to remain acutely aware that the work in Canada is not complete, and any conversation we have about going global with our record on LGBTI rights has to be done with an awareness that the work at home is not complete. And I say this as a moral and political philosopher, one who works deeply and intimately with queer residents and citizens of Canada who have moved here largely as refugees as they try to get services which are attentive to the special needs that they bring to us. And I say this as a political and moral philosopher who believes as a matter of principle. Here's what we already know. This is the part where I say the things that we already know, but that's why you bring philosophers to podiums. As a matter of principle, our country has an important role to play on the global scale, but also on pain of being hypocritical, that it cannot forget the duties it has to the citizens whom it is tasked with protecting, many of whom remain vulnerable to inexcusable violence and discrimination, and which we read about every single day in our newspapers. So I will invite our panelists, who I will introduce in a moment, our amazing panelists in a moment, to share their thoughts on where we are now as a country, how we can best work to protect human rights of LGBTI individuals abroad, this is the panel's focus, while acknowledging that at home we have work to do to protect and support vulnerable Canadians who have a right to expect their government to protect them. So that is the end of the conclusion. That's the conclusion of the part that we all already agree and know. So let me introduce our panelists. I'm going to do it in alphabetical order, just so you know how I've chosen this. So having said that, the first person I'm going to introduce is my friend and colleague, Stephen Brown. Stephen is professor of political science here at the University of Ottawa. His research focuses mainly on the intersection of the policies and practices of northern countries and other international actors with politics in southern countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. He's published on democratization, political violence, peace building, and transnational justice and rule of law in Angola, Kenya, Malawi, Mozambique, and Rwanda. Most of his recent work is on foreign aid, especially Canada's, and we're going to ask him some questions about this later, for which he has conducted field work in Ethiopia, Ghana, Mali, and Peru. Sitting just beside him is Randy Boissonnault, who is Member of Parliament for Edmonton Centre and Special Advisor to the Prime Minister on LGBTQ issues. Prior to his election, Randy was a successful entrepreneur, community leader, and philanthropist. And he discovered his passion for leadership and public service at the University of Alberta. He said that he was feeling nostalgic when he came onto the University of Ottawa campus. Yeah. But at the University of Alberta, he served as president of the Students' Union, and then since studying at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, Randy has worked as a lecturer at the University of Alberta's campus, Saint-Jean, and as a journalist and political commentator for CBC, Radio-Canada, and Les Affaires. Jackie Hansen, sitting just beside him, is a gender rights campaigner at Amnesty International Canada. For the past 5 years, she's covered women's rights, LGBTI rights, torture, and the rights of human rights defenders, which is a lot. Before that, it's short, but a lot. That's important. I just wanted you to dwell on that. Okay. Before that, she spent 13 years with the International Campaign to ban landmines, to ban anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions. And finally, we have joining us by Skype. Actually, can UCS? I can't remember UCS. Anyway, by Skype is Nicole Nussbaum, who's a barrister and solicitor in London, Ontario, where I believe she actually is physically located right now. Her particular expertise is gender-related legal issues, and she has extensive experience with policy work related to gender identity and gender expression. She acts as project lead of the Transforming Justice Project, a legal needs assessment of the trans community in Ontario, which is administered by the HIV and AIDS Legal Clinic Ontario with funding from Legal Aid Ontario and the Ontario HIV Treatment Network. If you were counting, I just said Ontario 4 separate times in that sentence. Nicole is a past president of the Canadian Professional Association for Transgender Health and a past chair and current executive member of the Canadian Bar Association's Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity section. In 2014, Nicole instructed the first course in Canada to deal specifically with gender identity and the law, offered in the Department of Women's Studies and Feminist Research at Western University. So that was my second job. My third job is to ask probing and pressing questions. So I will start from here. So the way we're going to go is I'm going to ask some questions and invite everybody to offer sort of 2 or 3 minutes on their thoughts, and then I have some more pointed questions that we can get to. If you guys want to weigh in, you're welcome. Or you're just here to hang out. And then in about a half an hour, we'll open up to the audience, if that works for everybody. So I think the first question, sort of factual question. According to the four of you, and maybe we'll start in the reverse order from introduction. So maybe Nicole will start with you, if you can hear me, and that's okay. And what are the trends and developments related to LGBTI human rights where countries like Canada might usefully take action? So what would you say, in your view, are the central trends and developments in LGBTI human rights where countries like Canada and other countries interested in these kinds of questions can usefully take action?
Sure. So that's a small question to start off.
And you have 3 minutes.
3 minutes. So, I mean, I participated in a convening around dealing specifically with trans human rights issues that was put on by the International Association of Civil Liberties Associations in Cape Town, South Africa at the beginning of this year, and I recently returned from Chile, where I was doing some work to share Canadian experiences around the pursuit of human rights for trans and gender nonconforming folks in Canada. And I think there are really commonalities across the board in terms of the issues that people are facing. So I'll start specifically focused on trans people. Identity recognition is a huge issue globally. It's still an issue in Canada. And that includes name change, sex designation change, and also recognition of non-binary identities. Access to medical care is an issue. Discrimination in employment, education, housing, access to services, all of those things remain relatively common in Canada, but equally or more so in other countries. Family rejection is a big issue. Housing, homelessness, in part, relating to rejection from families, especially among young people. Police violence is a huge issue. Sex work for trans women in particular is an issue, just both with how it's criminalized and or regulated, but also how it serves sort of globally to be a viable source of income when people are rejected from much of society. I think another issue is in terms of Indigenous models for sex, gender, Indigenous traditions around the world, and respect for those traditions and those identities, and the ongoing effects of colonization in terms of criminalization that's been exported that criminalizes homosexuality and often expression of gender identity as well. So I think those are all big issues that impact trans folks globally, and I think I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to go into more detail about any of those issues.
Great, thank you very much. Jackie?
Yeah, absolutely. Agree with everything that was just said. I mean, I think it's useful before I get all doom and gloom to note that there are some rays of light. We had good news from Australia yesterday around same-sex marriage. We've had some advances here in Canada. The inclusion of LGBTI rights in the peace process in Colombia. So important to note that there is some hope. There are some rays of light. But there's also some things coming across my desk as someone covering these issues with Amnesty International that are quite alarming and concerning. We are seeing what it appears to be a wave, an increase of state-sanctioned violence. So whether that is in Chechnya or more broadly throughout Russia, certainly in Egypt, countries that was mentioned, Turkey, Azerbaijan, a number of different Central Asian countries, Indonesia. We, as Amnesty, there's a number of individual cases that we work on, and the number of LGBTI cases that are urgent, that are crossing my desk. This year I've never seen such a high number of cases. And it's not just one individual, it's a wave. And so these are things that we know that there's just been 49 people who've been convicted in Egypt. And we're seeing similar things in other countries. So that state-sanctioned violence, it's not one-off cases, is definitely concerning to us. We're also concerned about criminalization of same-sex sexual relations. So criminalization or recriminalization in some cases. But what we're also seeing is the application of other criminal laws that are being disproportionately applied to LGBTI folks. So for example, in Egypt, same-sex sexual relations are actually not illegal. And so what people are being convicted of is actually debauchery. So some of these kind of old, obscure laws that are still on the books are now being disproportionately applied, and so de facto they're then criminalizing LGBTI folks. So that's something that we are seeing increase, and we're quite concerned about. We also can't divorce this trend from broader issues that we are seeing. And so more broadly as Amnesty, we're seeing the shrinking space for civil society. And so we cannot look at LGBTI rights violations in isolation from these broader trends. So an example of this is in Russia. So a couple years ago, before the Sochi Olympics, we had a campaign that was raising awareness about threats to freedom of expression, assembly, association. And folks here were saying, well, can't we just focus on LGBTI rights? And activists on the ground were saying, actually, no, we don't want you to do that. This is part of a much broader trend. Let's talk about the Foreign Agents Law. Let's talk about all these various pieces. Are LGBTI folks being disproportionately targeted as part of this broader trend? Probably yes. But what we were cautioned was to really look at this much broader picture about shrinking civil society. And then the effect of that is the chill that then creates. So we released a report yesterday, 2 days ago, on enforced disappearances and killing of human rights defenders, and really looking at, for LGBTI rights defenders in particular, so looking at a case in Bangladesh. So 2 murders in April of 2016 of prominent activists basically put a chill on activism in the entire country of Bangladesh and sent the LGBTI community into hiding. And so what we are really looking at unpacking is the impact of this chill on civil society and how that is serving to set back advances that were made in LGBTI rights. So that's why I was saying I wanted to share some rays of light before I did my doom and gloom, because there are some reasons to be hopeful, and there's some great examples to look to, but there's also a lot of work that remains.
Well, good afternoon everyone. Thank you. C'est une grande plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui. Merci à l'Université d'Ottawa. Thank you, SIPS. Great to be here. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici. I'd like to thank Global Affairs and my parliamentary colleagues, Omar and Matt, for kicking us off so well. Members of the LGBTQ Secretariat who are here to help. And just for your knowledge, we have missions being represented here from around the world. So Albania, Argentina, Austria, Belgium, Brazil, Netherlands, New Zealand, and Norway. Thank you for being with us. And if I missed you, let us know that you were here afterwards so we know how to stay in touch with you for future events. It's only in solidarity and working together in forums like the Equal Rights Coalition, Organization of American States, the United Nations, La Francophonie, the Commonwealth, and others that we can do this important work. So if you start from the principle that all human beings are born free and equal, and if you start from the principle that human rights are inalienable, universal, indivisible, then Canada has a moral imperative to help anybody in the world whose basic human liberties and freedoms as a human being are curtailed because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. Full stop. So there is a moral imperative to our work. And I think it's important for us to root everything that we are doing as a country on the LGBTQ2 file, both domestically and internationally, from a fundamental expression of human rights. That's what this is all about. And what are we talking about in terms of curtailment of freedoms? We're talking about 70 countries that criminalize same-sex behavior. We're talking about 5 countries that would kill me if I were there. I'm the first openly gay member of parliament elected from Alberta to sit in the federal parliament. The kind of barriers that LGBTQ or LGBTI people face internationally, everything from discriminatory social attitudes, targeted laws and penalties, inability to have a job or get access to basic health care, or to find an apartment because you're trans, or because you're bisexual, or because you're flamboyantly gay, or because you're a lesbian. Just for being who you are, you're going to be denied the same rights and freedoms that other citizens have. There is sexual and gender-based violence, there's state-supported violence, and we have a lot of work to do around the world to see that this ends. And so the more visible your difference, the more likely you are a target of violence or discrimination. And so when we talk about how wonderful it is to be open and out and positive here about who you are, that becomes a target on your back in many countries in the world. And so that is where global affairs, our government works very deftly, and more behind the scenes than not, because we hear from activists and advocates on the ground all the time that quiet and behind the scenes with the people in power is better than bold and brash and in people's face, because that puts lives at risk. And so I just think it's important for people in this room, and I know you'll ask me some questions about this hopefully later, is that we are staunch and ardent defenders for LGBTI rights around the world, and yet we're not preachy. We are not perfect. We are a long way from perfect. The LGBTI movement in Canada left queer people of color behind. We left trans people behind. We left seniors who are now being recloseted, kind of forgotten because they did all the battles for us in the 70s and 80s. Well, now they're being recloseted as they try to find other places to live. So we are focused on all of the members of the Rainbow Coalition as we move forward, and we are humble and honest about that on the international stage.
Great, thank you. An advantage or disadvantage of going last is that there isn't that much left to say. So I'll try to keep it short so we can move on to other questions. I think this was the warm-up question. So something that I would just add is a caution to remember that what we're talking about internationally, and so I'm a political scientist, you know my bias, is political phenomena. And I think it's really important to remember that this isn't just like a cultural thing, like those people are homophobic or transphobic. But that often the countries that we'll be talking about have histories of tolerance of difference. And that laws criminalizing often came from colonial powers. And laws that have been reintroduced recently, some of which are very severe, have more to do with domestic politics across a range of issues than, oh, they're just a really homophobic country or they have a homophobic culture. So it's important to remain very aware that state-sponsored homophobia as part of wider, broader struggles, usually for survival of authoritarian regimes, And it's very important to keep that political analysis and not just reduce it to it's an issue that only concerns LGBTI. And part of this was mentioned by the issue of social space and so on. And another thing to remember, I think that's really important, which I forgot. It'll come back. I'm sure it'll come back in the other questions. So.
Excellent. So Randy,
Okay,
you can remark.
I don't.
So one of the introducers recently pointed out that Canada has just adopted the co-chairship of the recently launched Equal Rights Coalition, which is a coalition of nearly 30 countries aimed at strengthening cooperation among countries to support and protect LGBTI rights globally. So this is a warm-up question, but would you like to tell us a little bit more about what that coalition is and what Canada aspires to do during its co-chairship?
I'm honored to, and I would like to thank publicly Minister Freeland for leaning in hard on this issue and working with her colleagues internationally to position Canada and to offer Canada's support, and that includes financial support, to be a co-chair with Chile of the Equal Rights Coalition, which started in Montevideo, Uruguay in 2016, deftly co-chaired by the Netherlands and Uruguay for the first 14 months of its existence. And so we are honored to serve as co-chairs with Chile for the next 2 years of the existence of the organization. And what is it? So we're 35 nations dedicated to ending biphobia, transphobia, homophobia in our own countries and around the world. And let me share with you some member states. Albania, Argentina, Austria, Chile, Costa Rica, the Czech Republic, Lithuania, Malta, Montenegro, Serbia, Slovenia, Ukraine, Switzerland, and others. You can go online. So there are people, there are states, as part of the ERC, that you would not necessarily expect to be there, and they're with us, and this is not a finger-pointing exercise. This is how do we work together to extend basic human rights to LGBTI people in our countries. And I had the honor to attend a meeting in the United Nations at the Canadian Mission in New York in advance of technical missions, and our goals over the next 2 years are to strengthen the mechanisms that bind these 35 nations together, that help us do the work that we need to do. And that's everything from working within our 35 nations, but also finding other nations that are prepared to join the ERC, including in the Global South and in Asia Pacific. And also working with existing members to work with us to have démarches in those particular parts of the world where this issue may be more challenging to have that conversation. And I want to just, echo what Stephen said. Because when we worked on the apology, we made sure that there were at least one faith-based representative in our National Advisory Council, because we often put LGBT rights and faith-based rights, religious rights as opposites. They are not. We have, the whole person includes LGBTI people of faith. And that means that we have faith-based allies out there. And so it's really important to understand that within the faith-based communities, there are actors that are trying to stop the money that's flowing from Canada and other countries that go to parts of the world that then scare the politicians there to actually passing laws to go against our people. So the Brits, and they said this, there's an all-party parliamentary group report about the responsibility the United Kingdom takes for laws that it has put on the books and how they're working with states to turn that back. But the playbook is out there, and we know because we still have some of those laws in the books. We're trying to get Section 159 repealed here in Canada. That'll happen as part of C-39 legislation. But here's an example where you can't get too far ahead and preach until you're really sure that your own house is really clean, and that's why we have a lot of work to do. So we're honored to co-chair the Equal Rights Coalition. There are 4 working groups which we can get into in more details, and they are ably supported by Global Affairs and Erin. Make sure everybody knows who you are, because she's our lead here in Canada, with Mark Allen from Global Affairs. And just understand how much this is important, that our ambassador to the United Nations, Marc-André Blanchard, His Excellency, is completely committed to us getting this right and to doing everything we need to do. And this includes, and I'll end on this, in an international conference that will be held in 2018, and stay tuned for more details on that, because it is all member states plus civil society organizations, so that we can shine a light on the important work that is being done and all of the work that yet needs to be done.
I'm going to ask you a follow-up question.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question, but I'm going to ask you the same question, so you can get ready. So, can you talk a little bit about how this coalition is going to act to protect the safety of those to whom it offers support? So I'm reflecting on the comment that you made about how some of the work that Canada is doing is behind the scenes and not old and brash. And part of the reason for that is to protect the individuals that are intending to support. So I'm wondering about how the coalition is intending to act in that space. And then I'm going to ask Jackie to give you some advice about best practices.
We welcome that. And we had a great meeting at the ERC with them, as a full transparency. Amnesty International was one of the CSOs that I was able to meet with in the United Nations. Well, let me answer the question by sharing with you the 4 thematic groups, okay? So international and regional diplomacy, LGBTI inclusion in 2013 Agenda for Sustainable Development, coordination of donor funding, and the national laws, policies, and practices to protect LGBTI people. That's a lot. Times 35 nations, times several more that we want to join us. So it's about working with each other to say, what are your best practices, what are your laws, how do we advance here? Look, it took us till 2017 to get trans legislation passed here, to protect trans people. This is Canada, and we got it done in a year, but it was an 11-year fight to make that happen. So there are best practices that we can share. I mean, look, I'll put this bluntly. The Dutch have a fund that allows civil society organizations to do this important LGBTI work around the world. We're not there yet as a government. I'm working on it, and we're working on it with ministry, and we're going to go talk to Minister Morneau about it. But there's an example where, you know, our own CSOs could use support from the federal government to go and do their important work internationally. So there's a lot of learning we have to do too. And we're coming out of, I'll be political, we're coming out of 10 years of an administration that didn't really care about these issues. And so we're changing some ships of state to this area. The other piece is to work with existing member states to go talk to some other nations that you might think would be natural fits for the ERC, and maybe they just haven't gotten to it yet, and we will have those conversations so that by the end of 2 years, we can say that we have more member states.
That funny moment when the government of Canada mentions your own lobbying points. More money, yes. Dedicated funding mechanisms, yes. So there we go. No, that's fantastic, and that's certainly something that we're strong advocates for. And love hearing more about the work of the Equal Rights Coalition, and I think there's a lot of work as well as at the headquarter level of missions that can really be happening at high commissions and embassies around the world. So we know that on a range of issues there's often informal groups of embassies that come together, whether it's on women's rights or on other issues, to advocate together. And certainly I think this is an area where that sort of work would be great. I just actually had colleagues who came back from a mission to Guatemala, and they were talking about their really positive engagement with the Canadian Embassy in Guatemala, and said specifically around LGBTI issues that the embassy in Guatemala is doing some really great work with grassroots folks on the ground, and that was the first thing they said to me when they came back was, this is notable, we wanted to make sure we shared it back, this is fantastic. So more of that would be fantastic. As well as the Equal Rights Coalition, there's some other really fantastic opportunities for Canada to engage in other multilateral forums. So our membership in Francophonie gives us an opportunity to engage with some other Francophone states. And certainly CHOGM is I think a really, really key one, giving some of the colonial legacies, some of these laws that are still on the books, to engage in particular with some countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But in terms of approach, you know, we very much have welcome that approach of that quiet, softer approach, and not going out too loud and forcefully, but really listening to voices on the ground and getting a sense of when people want noise made, when that's really not a safe, useful thing to do, and really being guided by the grassroots activists on the ground, and really having good, you know, when embassies have good, diverse, broad partnerships with civil society on the ground, that's going to lead to some really great partnerships and some really, really good collaboration.
Nicole, can you hear me?
Use the microphone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a microphone.
Oh, sorry.
So Nicole, the two last speakers have been talking about talking about the ways in which Canada can learn from others and lead others. And I'm wondering if you were able to speak. I know that you just mentioned this in your introductory talks, but you're just back from Santiago. But I'm interested in whether or not you think, or the ways in which Canada can learn from or can teach the world about advocacy with respect to specifically with respect to trans individuals and trans migrants people who cross borders?
Okay, so I want to acknowledge that Ambassador Patricia Pena invited me to come down and charged her staff with finding a Canadian expert to be able to share some background on the human rights framework in Canada and also the state of affairs for trans people in Canada and the issues that we're dealing with here. And I mean, my sense is that it was very much based on her initiative to say that this is an important issue to be dealing with. But the embassy has been cultivating a relationship with LGBT community for quite some time, participating in film festivals and otherwise, forging a relationship with groups on the ground. So I just want to step back to something that was said before. Walking the walk, I think, is the most important. It's the most important thing to be able to, go to another country and be able to do something and share something positive. Being able to go and meet with trans rights organizations, and say, we have explicit human rights protections in every province, territory, and in the federal jurisdiction as well. That was a tremendously powerful statement to be able to make. And I think it was one that just, for trans people, validation of trans, just erasure is such a big problem for trans community in Canada and around the world. So that explicit protection and that statement that that Canada recognizes, not only recognizes that trans people exist, but stands up for their rights, is just something powerful to be able to share. And it's still a relatively rare thing to have nations that have that kind of explicit protection. And I think that that's something that the sort of the activists and the groups took a lot of strength from and inspiration from, recognizing, I think, that just because there are formal protections doesn't mean that that those protections live and breathe the way we would like them to. So I think being able to walk the walk, and the better we're able to walk the walk domestically, the greater credibility we will have internationally.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'm going to change the topic slightly to bring Stephen into the conversation. Stephen, you mentioned in your sort of opening comments that you had some thoughts about what role foreign aid should play in promoting and protecting LGBTI rights and internationally. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you think is the best way for foreign aid to play a role here?
Okay, great, thanks. So a lot of what we've been talking today so far has been about more at the diplomatic level. So working at the UN, working with the Francophonie, the Commonwealth, and so on. And that's more the diplomacy side of Global Affairs Canada. But there's a lot that can be done on the development side as well. One thing that I think is very important is to have funding available for local groups, and not just for activities. So not just sponsoring a film festival or something like that, but core funding for local, either LGBTI groups or human rights groups that work on LGBTI rights. And one thing I would like to see is a special fund for this kind of thing. So Canada recently announced a new feminist international assistance policy. It's got special funding for women's groups. I would love to see special funds for groups working on LGBTI rights. I think it would have to be clear that this goes towards core funding, so to help organizations rent an office, a telephone, have an internet connection, maybe have their own website, resources like that, Because all too often, the way it works with Canadian or other aid bureaucracies is that they'll only fund activities, and then you have to have a whole results-based management framework, and the guidelines for that will be 43 pages, and your little volunteer LGBTI group cannot access these funds. So we have to set up a much more flexible mechanism to facilitate the work of these groups on the ground.
Okay. Is that a figure?
May I?
Hot pursuit.
No, I think Stephen raises a really good point. I think we need to do it, and I think I would just like to credit where credit is due, because some of this was in motion and we've amplified it, but 2.9 million in funding since 2014 for organizations that are working against gender violence and transphobia, homophobia, biphobia. But here's one that I want people to know. In 2016-17, so definitely on our watch, $500,000, 24 projects in 19 countries. Is it enough? No, but is it tracking the right direction? Yes, and I like what you said, and I understand what you're asking for is almost heresy inside the government, which is more funding. I mean, I can't find more, that is like not the mantra of any government department, and if government officials, you can close your ears, but I mean, that is a politician's dream. That's harder for a bureaucracy to make happen because then it bakes it in, right, to the funding envelopes, and so I'm mindful of that, and we've heard you, but look, this is where we need, and I will shout out to, it's Kaleidoscope Trust in the United Kingdom that is taking responsibility for the countries that it colonized, where the old laws are still on the books, and reaching out to corporate entities in those countries to say, you have a moral responsibility to help us dial some of these laws back, and that includes cash on the barrelhead. So I like that model, where we actually reach out to corporates and unions and other civil society actors to amplify the work that government is doing. And I can tell you that is a conversation that we have at the Secretariat on a regular basis, and it's certainly conversations that Mark and Aaron and I have had.
I'll save it.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a follow-up, which is, since you mentioned it, Canada has just announced a feminist international assistance policy. And the stated objective of the policy is to support women and girls around the world by working to eliminate sexist and misogynist barriers to their success. And I wonder what, and I just recently read it, and it actually doesn't contain any reference to LGBTI rights. So I'm wondering.
Actually,
What
that's
does?
It does.
Does.
You gotta dig though.
four.
Gotta dig.
I'll tell you in a
Okay.
second.
So tell me, okay, excellent. So I'm happy to be corrected
It's
on
there.
this. So tell me then, my question.
Where is it?
What is the place of LGBTI rights in Canada's new feminist international assistance policy? What are you hoping will be the rights, the LGBTI rights in this new policy? And how should this plan generally intersect with the support and protection of LGBTI rights?
Okay, that's a lot to answer in 3 minutes. But,
You can have four.
okay. So 4 is the number of times that gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation are mentioned in the Feminist International Assistance Policy, known as FIAP. So I will say FIAP, that's the new aid policy. So it's there 4 times. It's always in a very long list of every single kind of axis of oppression that you can imagine. So it's, gender, these issues, race, class, ethnicity, religion, disability, like everything. And there's nothing specific about LGBT or gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, which is a bit surprising because the policy should be about gender, and it's supposed to be about gender. And by their very names, gender expression and gender identity are about gender. And sexual orientation is also about gender, more indirectly though, because it's the gender of the person you're attracted to, not your own gender. So I would have liked to, so first let me say I support the Feminist International Assistance Policy. I'm fully in favor of a greater focus on women and girls. But it uses the word intersectional approach several times, but it's not really an intersectional approach. It's gender first, or women and girls first. And then as we recognize that women have other identities, and then it just lists them all. And the weakest sentence, or the weakest statement around all of that is by sending, this is a paraphrase, by empowering women and girls, we send a powerful message that all forms of equality are important, or all forms of inequality are wrong, or something like that. And I felt that that's actually disappointing, because you can support women's rights and still be homophobic, transphobic, classist, etc. So I felt that that was very naive. It's a distortion of the notion of intersectionality. So that was a little bit off. In a sense, it's a bit of a lost opportunity, and I don't, like, this really is progressive in so many ways as a new policy, but in other ways it's not. So it claims to be about gender equality. It's not really about gender. It's about women and girls. And very little is said, nothing is said about other gender identities, and there's only one mention of men and boys. So working for gender equality is not just helping women and girls. And in some ways, it's a repackaging of the kind of assistance that we've had since the 1980s of just focusing on women in development. And so I think of what would be much more progressive and more truly feminist is to rethink the kinds of forms of development assistance and not just adding women and girls in STEM. So there's more to the question, but.
I think that covers it. I'm gonna open up a variation on this question to everybody, which is, so Stephen has just offered us some thoughts on various lessons that we might have about pursuing LGBTI advocacy globally. So let me ask this question. What, according to, we'll start with Jackie, because she's who spoke recently. What are some of the lessons learned, would you say, on LGBTI advocacy globally? What doesn't work? Where has Canada made mistakes, perhaps in not paying adequate attention to the population and the feminist international assistance policy? And where is it a leader, in your view?
Well, just to pick up on the previous comment, though, I did just want to say that, you know, I also cover women's rights for Amnesty as well, and so, you know, I think through the FIAP, a lot of feminist organizations have been saying, fund the grassroots, and really echoing that call for core funding. And so I think it's a broad civil society need, that it's about keeping the lights on and keeping things going and not just the activities. So absolutely agree on that. I think some of the lessons learned, what works, what doesn't work. I mean, I think what works is listening to the grassroots, listening to folks who have lived experience. I mean, we all know we're only, you know, the experts in our own experience. And so if you take that to a civil society level, folks in country, they know their lived experience, they know what's needed, but they also know how to be really strategic and know how that often changes day by day. There might be a moment where a démarche would be the perfect opportunity and really welcome. There might be another moment where it's, you know what, please don't do that, that's the last thing we need, and that shifts. So having that flexibility to respond to those needs on the ground, I think is a real opportunity. I think, and a lesson that I know that I have seen, learned from this week was the 20th anniversary of the Landmine Treaty. And I worked for a long time on that, and one of the really unique things about that was, you know, the partnership between civil society and government. And it was a really special and unique thing. And that kind of partnership, that kind of respect where it's not always collaboration. I mean, we have our very different roles, but being able to share information and government recognizing that as civil society, we are the eyes and ears on the ground, and we probably have a greater sense, just because of where we're placed, of what's going on in small communities, etc., that there are ways that we can collaborate in ways that are mutually beneficial. Also meeting activists where they're at, I think that's something that is a good lessons learned in principle. There may be times where, quite literally, it's meeting activists where they're at. There may be times where you have to leave an embassy, you need to go to someone's community, you need to do a site visit, you need to go to a court hearing. There may be other times where you want to create a layer of visibility and you want to be tweeting and you want to actually be inviting people to events at the embassy so that you're showing that these are important people, that you're, you know, it's going to go noticed if they suddenly disappear, and Canada's going to make a stir and create some noise. And so just being flexible to those needs and meeting activists where they are at, I think is the most important lesson learned. From a range of issues, not just on LGBTI rights, and really just saying things at the highest levels possible, being engaged multilaterally, but being willing to be an edge walker. So we know that in UN forums, that, you know, when there's declarations that are being negotiated, the first languages to go is anything around sexual orientation, gender identity, sexual and reproductive rights, and then women go out completely. So, you know, we know that this is the space that's really hard at the international level, but being willing to join with Norway and some others who are willing to put some really strong language out there, I think is is really, really important to be that kind of edge walker and consistently in all forums, both regionally at the international level, putting those same messages out. And it's also important so that activists in country know consistently what they can expect from Canada. I know that the activists that my colleagues were meeting with in Guatemala, they have an expectation now of the Canadian Embassy in Guatemala and the kind of collaboration that's possible, and we want to make sure that that's consistent across all Canada's representatives around the world.
Great. Nicole, I don't know if you heard the question, I'll just repeat it for you. What would you say that, what are some of the lessons learned for LGBTI advocacy globally? What doesn't work? Where's Canada making mistakes? And where, since we're here, where is it a leader in your view?
Okay, so just to take it back to a trans context, I don't think there has really been a history that we can learn from, because trans rights in Canada even have only come to the fore, gained visibility since probably 2012, 2013, and as we all acknowledge, explicit protections only came through earlier this year. So, I mean, what works, is, I don't think there's a track record. A question that I have is, how do we focus on the needs of the most marginalized populations? Prison issues and what we're doing internationally around prison standards may very well have a significant effect for trans people if these sort of waterline issues, like how sex work is dealt with, drug laws, those sorts of things, how we approach those issues in our diplomacy and in support, and if we're supporting NGOs that are working on those issues as well. So, there are trans organizations that are working on sex work issues in a variety of places. Are we working with them? Or at least are the organizations we are working with dealing with those issues, right? So I think we have to keep an eye on the most marginalized populations and the most affected populations, as well as issues. I mean, so all issues dealing with employment. If we're doing international trade agreements, incorporating human rights standards and naming gender identity and gender expression and being firm on those sorts of those protections is certainly important. But then working domestically and supporting a range of organizations, I think, is important as well.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. Randy has just told me that he has to leave at the very latest in 7 minutes. So this means that I'm going to open it up to questions right away, because this might be your only moment to ask Randy a question. Does anybody
Promise to return.
Okay, we'll take those two.
Do him first. I will talk to Randy another time.
Okay.
My name's Phil Crosby. Most of my career was in foreign affairs, not global affairs. My question was the extent to which you found using arguments other than human rights to make the case in support of providing rights to these individuals, whether you found that has been useful. I think the starting point we've all said is we have to listen to local communities and local activists. But there are economic, political, cultural, religious, so many grounds on which you can make the case in support of equality. And I'd like to know the extent to which you've seen those being used, not necessarily by government, but we should at least be aware of them, to avoid the situation where we're always characterized as Western nations trying to push a certain agenda. Now, the 35, that coalition obviously includes countries that are not just the traditional Western ones. That's really important. And I'm wondering whether or not those other arguments are being used by them in their own communities.
It's a great question, and it's a whole seminar for the answer. The short answer to your question is that the arguments are being used, diverse arguments are being used all the time. And when we say quiet diplomacy is the best angle, we mean path of least resistance to get the results that we'd like to see for the people who are being harmed right now. And so if your religion believes that, God is love, then love thy neighbor and make sure you're not throwing them in jail for who they love. It's a pretty straightforward argument. We just need to amplify it and use it a lot more. The economics of exclusion, great work done by the World Bank, and Cliff, the VP of Diversity, whose last name I always forget, has a really interesting article on it, a paper on it, and I've written a couple of speeches now about the economics of inclusion. Wherever you work, ask yourself how many people work in your organization, your university, your federal public service, or your company, or your union. Take 15% of that bottom line, 15% of that total. Do not show up at work mentally, even though they're there physically and getting a paycheck. So that's because of racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia. So what is 15% of the workforce not showing up worth to your organization? That's how I get the Chambers of Commerce. I start with an economic argument first, get their attention by hitting them in the pocketbook, and then I end on human rights and basic love, and that we're all just people, and you probably all know somebody or have somebody in your family who's on the community, and so start stepping up and sticking up for them. That's the whole speech in about 30 seconds. And there are also countries where we can't do anything until we protect kids first, because of the old arguments that if you promote LGBTI rights, you're going to harm kids. So we walk in and say, here, we'll give you a whole range of child protection laws at the same time that you dial back your anti-sodomy laws. And we walk the two in at the same time. So justice is as important as is defense, as is international development in these conversations. And that's why I'm so honored to be part of a government that is a whole of government approach, because we're having these conversations all the time.
Okay, there's two, you have to take two more questions. You talk fast.
Again, do the other one first. It's really okay.
We have one more question, and I'm getting the wrap up. So there's a question in the front. Can I not take two questions? Two questions?
You may not live, but go on.
No. Let's take the question. Yeah, just wait a minute. You don't want any? Yeah? Who's going to take one?
My question is very direct. It's about money.
I like money questions. I go find it.
Yeah, I'm part of I'm a volunteer in a group called Rainbow Haven, and we sponsor refugees, maybe so far mainly Syrians and Indians. The question is, we need money. So is the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Grant expected to be renewed?
Is that the only question?
That's the only question. We need money.
Okay, so the question is the RAP program going to be continued? And that's an open discussion at IRCC. I can tell you what we are doing is we have funded the Rainbow Railroad organization out of Toronto. There's a new coalition that has started across the country of 10 organizations. And there's an open conversation of how we can support that network. I can tell you what I've learned from doing this work for just over a year now, is that our formal networks in the country are fragile to non-existent, and our informal networks are almost non-existent to very fragile. And so what role can the government play that isn't core funding, see the challenge I have, to support these organizations and make sure that they are well supported. And so we're looking very closely at the question you're asking us, but there's two issues, right? There's not just LGBTQ refugees, there's also LGBTQ internally displaced persons. Because you can be an IDP and we can do nothing for you as a refugee. You actually have to leave your country where you're threatened, become a refugee, so you're no longer an IDP, before most of the organizations on the ground like yours can help. So what is the government's systematic and comprehensive response to people who are at risk as internally displaced persons? And that is a conversation that we're looking at having in government. This is why we need to make sure that civil society organizations in our country and around the world are very healthy, because those are the people that we work with on the ground to get people to safety. And one thing I will tell you, and Omar knows this and Matt knows this, the government of Canada will never do a victory lap on any work that is being done that gets people to safety, but that might put other lives at risk. good work will take place, you will never hear us talk about it. And on that note, I must go. Thank you all very much.